Um, yeah, what a week. It's just every day something. But but before we talk about of course, everybody is talking about the.
China, yes,
Go ahead.
China's absolutely becoming more important every day. By the way, when we talk about all of these things,
Yeah.
we will find that China is there in the
Hmm.
background with all of them.
Yeah. So before we're talking about the trade deal, all that sort of thing, and Trump's trip and all that, I still want to go back to the victory parade because I think it's important. We talk
Yeah,
about history, right? And we
yes,
should not forget, lots of things happening today has is direct consequence of World War II. So
hmm
one thing, Xi Jinping before he went to Russia, he actually pinned a letter, I mean an article, and in Chinese and English, and I think it's important to talk about that a
yes.
little bit. So in that article, it was, of course, well published. I guess they published in Russia as well. So
Oh
in the article,
yeah.
he talked about how hard the World War II. It was hardly fought by both China and Russia, a Soviet, and how the friendship and all that kind of thing. But he also very much emphasized, the post-World War order now. It seems like the China and Russia is now keeping that order, basically
Yeah.
implying that the West is not doing that. And then, of course, for the Chinese, the one paragraph is extremely important. He talked about Taiwan, which lots of people probably don't know. Taiwan is direct result of World War II. So here's what he says. He said, Taiwan's restoration to China is a victorious outcome of World War II and an integral part of the post-war international order, a series of instruments with legal effect under international law, including the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation, have all affirmed China's sovereignty over Taiwan. The historical and the legal fact that therein brooks no challenge, and the authority of UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 brooks no challenge, no matter how the situation on the Taiwan island evolves or what troubles external forces may make, the historical trend toward China's ultimate and inevitable reunification is unstoppable. So he's reminding people the legal foundation for China's claim to Taiwan is not just the we, China here, claim that. They are legal foundations. What is your take on that?
You are absolutely correct. Now, I think a few things I would also like to say about Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, because
Mhm.
the media in Russia continue to talk about it. I'm talking. I mean specifically Xi Jinping's visit to
Hmm.
Moscow and his
Yeah.
attendance there. And Putin has been making various comments, further comments about this. And I don't know whether it's been picked up in China, but the Russians, Putin himself, has been saying that Xi Jinping was the primary guest
Hmm.
at this event, that he was, in fact, accepted by the Russians as the first amongst equals of all
Hmm.
of the other leaders there, that he was the most important and primary guest. So the Russian media has been reminding Russians that, of course, the Soviet Union made the biggest contribution to defeating Germany, but China made the biggest contribution to defeating Japan,
Hmm.
and that after the Soviet Union, it was China that suffered the greatest losses. So the Russians have always been, in my experience, much more conscious of China's contribution to the victory in the Second World War, which, remember, for the Russians is the most important single event in modern history by far.
Hmm.
It's the key event. But the media in Russia, and this isn't just state-controlled media, that there is state-controlled media in Russia,
Hmm.
but there's been a sustained effort in Russia to remind everybody in Russia that Russia's single most important ally by far
Hmm.
in the Second World War, in terms of the joint struggle against fascism, and in terms of the losses that it experienced, and in terms of its duration in fighting in the war, was China,
Hmm.
not Britain. not the United States. Now, this is an important. It's a shift
Yeah.
because, especially in Soviet times, at least the later Soviet times, it was always the alliance with the United States and Britain, and they will have the pictures of Yalta and Potsdam and Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill and all of that. But now, quietly, that is being downgraded, and they're talking about China as being the most important partner. And the point was that they hosted Xi Jinping in Moscow, and that was appropriate because of the role that China played in the struggle against the joint struggle against fascism in the Second World War. Now, all of that, and of course, the Russians have consistently taken a very strong line. By the way, they did even during the time of the Sino-Soviet conflict. They never, at any point, questioned that there was only one government in China, and that is the government of the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan was a part of it, is a part of China, and that the legitimate government of Taiwan, therefore, is the government of the People's Republic of China. Even during the tensions in the 60s and 70s, the Russians, to their credit, never lost sight of that, and always had at least that bit of sense never to go back on any of that. Anyway, Lavrov, by the way, about 3 weeks ago, actually did a wrong piece, which I should try and find for you, in which he discussed this issue of Taiwan, and he said this incredible hypocrisy that the Western powers are showing in relation to Taiwan, that they accept Taiwan as part of China, that they accept Taiwan as Chinese, and yet, despite all their other rhetoric about observing international law and all of that, they're really going out of their way to undermine it.
Yeah.
This point about that Xi Jinping has made, and it's been completely ignored in the West, by the way. His article is nothing that Xi Jinping ever says ever gets published in the West, at least not in the media here. You find lots of quotations of things that Xi Jinping is supposed to have said, which you quickly discover he never said. But what he actually says is scarcely ever published here. People, as a result, by the way, people have a completely mistaken view of his opinions and personality, which I can't emphasize too strongly how distorted people's understanding of his opinions is in the West. But this point he has made about Taiwan, the status of Taiwan having been settled over the course of these agreements that were reached at the end of the Second World War, which is the foundation period of international law, and of how China and Russia are the joint defenders of that peace settlement. Now, that's actually quite new. At least it is new to me. I've never come across this before. And by the way, Xi Jinping is absolutely right. The fact that it's new to me is a sign of how completely distorted the whole narrative about the end of the Second World War is in the West, because people just don't cover the Chinese side of the story. So because of this, these important facts tend to get overlooked. So it wasn't something that I'd appreciated myself, but he's absolutely right to bring it up, and he's absolutely right in the points that he is making, and it's good that he's reminding everybody of it, because it does go back to that time, and of course all of these decisions that were made at the time of the Second World War, they do a number of things. Firstly, they recognize that Taiwan had fallen under Japanese control as a direct product of Japanese aggression against China. So there's no question then at that time of Taiwan as being part of China and controlled by Japan as a result of fascist aggression.
Mm-hmm.
To,
Yeah.
to, to use that term simply. And of course, China is an ally in the Second World War and is recognized in all of those declarations as a victim of aggression, which it has been successfully resisting. So he's absolutely right in what he says, by the way, in every part of it. And of course, the decisions made in Potsdam are absolutely key in establishing the post-war settlement. Yalta and Potsdam
Mm-hmm.
are what lead to the creation of the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure whether China was represented in Yalta. I think it was in
It was.
Potsdam,
Um,
which is, but I mean, the thing
yeah.
to understand about Yalta and Potsdam
Uh-huh.
is that Yalta, they had this meeting and then it was postponed and then it was, adjourned. And then the meeting then was reconvened in
Uh-huh.
Potsdam because in Yalta they couldn't follow through with all parts of the meeting because they needed to defeat Germany first.
Mm-hmm.
So there was the meeting in Potsdam, which was a direct follow-up to the meeting in Yalta. Nothing about those two meetings, by the way, that you
Mm-hmm.
read in the West is true. I think China was represented
I
in
think so too.
Yalta.
Yeah.
No, sorry, in Potsdam.
Yeah.
I think so. And the point about Potsdam and Yalta is, of course, it set up the whole structure of international law, including it agreed on, it finalized the agreement on the United Nations. And of course, because China was at that time recognized as such a key ally, China was made one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a core participant in the victory. I would quickly add as a historical detail that the Soviet leader of that time, Joseph Stalin, took a very deep interest in Chinese matters.
Mm-hmm.
Other Soviet leaders who followed him, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and all of those, to nothing like the same extent. But
Mm-hmm.
Stalin was very, very interested in China. He was heavily involved in supporting China in the 1920s and 30s. He took a great interest in the conflict there between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China. He supported Mao's leadership of the Communist Party. Again, it's a more complicated story than I'm making it appear, but
Mm-hmm.
when Mao became leader of the Communist Party, Stalin accepted that. And again, there's lots of legends and stories about what happened when Chairman Mao came to Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think he came to Moscow twice in the
Uh-huh.
1940s. But the reality is that Stalin received him again as the most important leader in the international communist movement, apart from himself.
Mm-hmm.
And Chairman Mao was present during Stalin's 70th birthday celebrations. And if you see all of the film of that time, he
Mm-hmm.
has Mao sitting next to him. I mean,
Uh-huh.
so all the other people are behind, including all the other members of the Politburo. But Chairman Mao is always there, sitting along Stalin throughout all of those events. So Stalin certainly took a great interest in Chinese affairs and would have known all about Taiwan and had his own feelings about the Kuomintang and about
Mm-hmm.
Chiang Kai-shek in particular. And he certainly did understand fully the importance of China's contributions. And I'm sure that he was definitely one of those people who would have advocated strongly over Taiwan. And by the way, though I know less about this, I suspect that the same was true of President Roosevelt, who also
Uh-huh.
had a certain understanding and sympathy for China as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
So the interest in China faded in the West and even in the Soviet Union afterwards, but it was very much at the forefront of people's minds in the discussions that took place in the 1940s.
Yeah. Yeah, FDR was also instrumental in Xi Jinping's article. He
Yeah.
he also mentioned about the United Nations,
Yes.
come into place, and The UN five permanent member, the reason China got in, yes, the Soviet was supportive of that, and FDR was instrumental. I mean, FDR
Yeah,
has a very
absolutely.
interesting story with China. He never been to China, but he somehow have a very deep feeling for China because his grandfather on his mother's
Yes.
side did a lot of business in China. So I guess when he's
Oh,
growing
I didn't
up, he
know.
just heard a lot of nice stories about China, and in his grandfather's house is full of beautiful porcelains and stuff coming from China. So he just, I guess, grown up. And in that event, what I heard
Oh, right.
from,
I didn't know any of that. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and what I
Okay.
heard was that multiple sources saying when he brought up, okay, the five permanent member of the UN, he said China before he said about United Kingdom, and Churchill was shocked by that. That's what I heard.
Does well. That doesn't surprise me. By the way, the story that there was this great friendship between Churchill and Roosevelt is a myth, which the British have constructed.
Yeah.
It simply isn't true.
Uh-huh.
Roosevelt had a lot of. I mean, he didn't particularly like Churchill, and that's the
Uh-huh.
truth of it. But that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. But I think that Xi Jinping really want to convince, everybody. I mean, you don't
Yeah.
really need to
Yeah.
convince people, just the fact, right? Both the Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Proclamation. I mean, regarding China part, it's just saying that all the territories taken by the Japanese need to return back to China, and that's of course including Taiwan. And they never said anything about independence or split China, nothing like that. It's one China, and all the territories the Japanese took go back to China. That's it. And so not to get Taiwan back to China in lots of Chinese view is not following through what was settled during World War II. So it's not even respectful of everybody agrees. So that's how people sees it. And so, but
I
I don't think the West see it that way. They don't even talk about the Potsdam Proclamation or Cairo Declaration, right? That they really want people to forget about that. Don't you think that's what the West want to do?
Well, this is absolutely correct. I mean, this is what is so frustrating because
Yeah.
this is always the way with the West. History never really. I mean, the Western approach to history is to pick and choose.
Uh-huh.
You
Yeah.
pick and choose what you consider important and forget everything else. And what you want to remember anyway, you change and distort to your own advantage. So,
Yeah.
as I said, nothing that you read about the Yalta and Potsdam meetings is true, by the way. I mean, there was no discussion at those meetings about spheres of influence in Europe or anything like that, for example. I mean, that is a complete myth which has been debunked many times
Mhm.
and yet continuously gets resurrected.
Yeah.
And as for China, I can absolutely tell you without any doubt at all that if you go out into the streets in Britain and talk to British people and ask people what role did China play in the Second World War, most of them would assume that it played no role at all.
Yeah.
When I say most of them, I'd
Hmm.
say well over 99% of them.
Yeah.
The number of people in Britain who know anything about China and what China happened in China is minuscule.
Yeah.
And it is disgraceful, by the
Mhm.
way. It is absolutely shocking that it should be that way. And of course, it's that way because it is convenient to the powers that exist here
Yeah.
in the West to keep it that way. As I said, the Chinese people, as I've said many times, have the best historical memory. And this is a tradition that goes back throughout their history. The Russians do have a historical memory. In the West, as I said, it's the Orwellian approach
Yeah.
that, we choose that part of our history that suits us and make it up a bit also to suit us as well.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that Trump, when he was talking about this deal with China, which we will talk about later, he said that one of the things that China agreed is to China to open up everything, which I think he refers to financial market, which nobody think is true, but he likes to do that. I think that's probably will moving forward. China will discuss that with the U.S. At the U.S. Request, but I don't think China, agrees to open up its financial market for now. But in any event, Trump like to talk about, okay, China is opening up everything. for the United States. It's good for China. It's good for us, United States. And then he said, it's good for unification and peace. Now that got explosive coverage in China, both in Taiwan
Oh,
and in,
really?
yeah, yeah. And of course,
Oh,
the
really? Interesting.
inside the Taiwan, everybody is saying, "Oh, no, 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 that's not what he meant. He meant unification, meaning China and the U.S. will be in sync." No, that's not what he says. It's very clear what he said.
No. Yes.
But just so you know, it's a lot of things
Yeah.
interesting going on with Trump right now. So we'll
Yeah.
see.
Yes, I'm going to make a suggestion. In fact, that again with Trump, I mean everything is all over the place. You never
Yeah.
quite know what he means and what he doesn't mean. I sometimes think that he says these extraordinary things about China opening up its financial markets in order to manage to sneak something else in, which might be in this case unification, because he didn't really need to mention unification at all,
No, no,
actually, if
no.
you take a step back and think about this. Now,
Uh-huh.
I know that there are some people within the Trump administration, Vance, for example, I was saying, look, the United States has no interest in a conflict with China over Taiwan. It makes no sense for us.
Mhm.
Vance he comes across to be as somebody who absolutely does believe that what America needs to do at the moment is look after itself
Uh-huh.
and not get involved in wars in all sorts of other places and
Yeah.
conflicts in all sorts of other places. I don't mean by that to suggest, by the way, that he is a friend of China.
Mm-mm.
I,
No.
I, I don't think that's the spirit in which he's saying this. But I wonder whether he's simply saying to Trump, well, look, we've got to get along with China. Uh,
Mhm.
this issue of Taiwan is just a distraction. It's just a way to get, the arms lobby and people like Lindsey Graham and all those people to exert influence. And you see how destructive that's been altogether.
Mhm.
So, let's actually think about how to end this thing by agreeing to unification. After all, it's one part of China
Mhm.
reunifying with another part of China. And Trump
Mhm.
comes along and he says this extraordinary thing about opening up Chinese financial markets in order to introduce this idea of reunification, which, if he'd said it in any other way, might be controversial.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's the kind of thing Trump sometimes, it seems to me, does. Anyway, I didn't know that it had caused so much interest in China. Well, it's a step forward. Let's see whether it follows through, because with
Yeah.
Trump, you never know.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, the State Department came out also trying to uh, rolling back, walk
Yeah,
back and etc. But Trump himself never came back and said that that's not what I meant. He never said that.
no,
So we
no,
go with what he
no.
said, right? So
Yes.
okay.